Hello, and thank you for joining this Duty Legacy webinar. This is the first webinar which we have done, and this is going to be focused on transitional justice in Ethiopia. We currently have one of our speakers, a couple are running late, we'll still start. So as you'll all know, in November 2022, the government of Ethiopia and the Tigray People's Liberation Front signed the Cessation of Hostilities Agreement, the COHA for short, facilitated by the African Union and the African Union High-Level Panel, working with observers from the International Authority on Development, United Nations and the United States. Although the agreement has enabled some progress to disarmament and reconciliation, insecurity and slow recovery remains a challenge. A significant shortage of necessities, including food, water, and medical care, is exacerbated by damage to infrastructure. The full implementation of the COHA has yet to be achieved, and violence continues with little being done to engage with Ethiopia's national dialogue or to find a path forward. This conversation forms along with many other conversations on what's happening in Ethiopia, and particularly in the Tigray region right now, aimed at trying to find a path forward, although little progress remains. Our panelists with divergent backgrounds and other areas of expertise will help us better understand this crisis. In the room with us now, we have Kassa, and we're waiting for Kassay, Gebray, and Robel Alemu. I'll be your moderator today. My name is James Joseph. I'm the Managing Director of the Duty Legacy. The panel itself will be structured in 5 sections. First, a brief introduction by our panelists, and then a round of opening presentations for discussion in their relevant contexts. We'll then move on to 3 topics, drawing from the panelists' insights and expertise. Those are challenges to the implementation of the Cessation of Hostilities Agreement, the role of the international community in transitional justice, and local methods of transitional justice. We'll then wrap up with a move to a Q&A for the final 20 minutes, but we'll see how we get. One thing I want to say is, with tensions fraught in this space, as it is in many others, I want everyone to remember that this is a space to try and create change for all and come together within the broad tapestry of Ethiopian groups. So I'll now pass over to Kassa, the Director of Legacy Tigray Advocacy Group, to introduce herself. Over to you.
Thank you, James. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. My name is Kassa. I am the co-founder and president of Legacy Tigray Advocacy Group, which is an organization basically internationally on remote and virtually. We've been advocating on humanitarian assistance to Tigray for the past 4 years and still ongoing. I'm currently in Tigray right now, in Aksum to be exact, trying to be on the field, but we've been basically trying to raise awareness on the war crimes, crimes against humanity, and ethnic cleansing that's still ongoing within Tigray, and trying to make sure that our advocacy efforts are working closely with the international community and trying to get other international commissions to participate in justice and accountability, reparation, and of course, everything else when it comes to humanitarian service and assistance as well. So thanks, James, for having me. It's wonderful being able to have this discussion, as November is a very important month for Tigray and of course, the ongoing situation that we're seeing. You will be hearing a lot about Tigray for the month of November. So thank you for being here and thank you for giving us your time to listen to the cause of Tigray. Thanks.
Thank you, Eden. I'm gonna open just with a question for you, Eden, on, as you just said, we just marked 2 years of the anniversary of the Cessation of Hostilities Agreement, with little progress towards implementation and ongoing fighting, lack of resources, food, water, medical care. Could you give us a sort of overview of the situation on the ground as it stands currently, and sort of give the audience a flavour of what's going on?
Sure, thanks, James. So the Pretoria Agreement, or the COHA Agreement, the Cessation of Hostility Agreement, was signed on November 2, 2022, so 2 years ago now. The Ethiopian government and Tigray Regional Liberation Front signed this in South Africa, and it was a hope that probably could bring in an end to the crimes and the atrocities that was taking place within Tigray and the starting of healing and justice in Tigray. That was what everybody was hoping. That's what everyone was wishing for. However, still after the 2 years of the genocidal war and the still ongoing occupation and the violence that is still continuing within Tigray, there is not as much humanitarian support that has come into Tigray, the restoring of basic services, reconstruction and restoring of constitutional order, basically, and also you don't really see hope within Tigray right now. Basically, people, I'm sitting right here and I see, if not 100 or 50 tents of IOM just across from the hotel that I'm staying in right now. And this is in Aksum right now. So this is basically what we're looking at, where we have the life still is ongoing, but also the situations that we're seeing within Tigray with the humanitarian assistance, the IDPs, over 1 million who are still internally displaced within Tigray, the ones who are in Sudan refugee camps as well, who are still now experiencing a second conflict with the Sudan conflict that they're witnessing. So with everything else that's happening within Tigray, basic services as simple as education or healthcare access is non-existent, right? Like basically people who are able to afford it, people who are more likely to pay something for it, they are getting it, but the rest of the people of Tigray or the children of Tigray are remaining without these human rights, which is basically going to school. So the political challenge that we're seeing, these are just a few of the issues that is making the CO2 agreement, the full implementation of it, a little bit difficult, but there's a lot of holes in the CO2 agreement or the Pretoria agreement, because this 10-page document or agreement, it was one of those signed agreements that we hope that it will really bring in change. However, it was very vague, to say the least, right? Like there was no timeline, there was no who exactly will be implementing what, when it will be done, you know, where the resources will be coming from, and how are we going to get things done? It never really went into the discussion or the depths of it. So one of the things that I paid attention on is the humanitarian access, right? Like on that part, there's only 4 lines about the humanitarian services that needs to be restored within Tigray. So we basically have where it says the federal government is supposed to help, and the Tigray regional government or the interim government will be providing assistance. That's all there is to it. So how, what, everything else that is supposed to go into any intervention or any into implementation is really non-existent within the CO2 agreement. So therefore, it basically makes it this vague yellow card or red card that doesn't really give an actual meaning per se right now. So, and also the CO2 agreement, we were hoping it will make Tigray accessible for all Tagaru, right? Like, so basically where we're saying Western Tigray is still under the occupation of the Eritrean troops, where Southern Tigray was still recently and still is experiencing violence, but was under the Amhara militia, and Northern Eastern Tigray, which is the Europe, still is under occupation where there's no access to it. So 40% of the population of Tigray, or the 40% of Tigray still remains under occupation of those perpetrators. So just to give you an idea of that, that's what's happening. I've been sitting here and this is maybe the 3rd time that the light went off, right? Like, so this is something that is the reality of Tigray right now, what we're doing and what we're dealing with. And to say the least, the change is not here after 2 years, even though this has been signed 2 years ago.
Thank you, Eden. I think this is the one of the big issues with anything truth and justice related or post-conflict related, which we see across Africa, I think, but specifically in this region in Ethiopia, specifically in Tigray and the various groups in Ethiopia, there is a lack of emphasis on truth, justice, and reconciliation and how we move forward. You'll know as well about the Ethiopian National Dialogue, which has been talked about for some time, but there's still again no emphasis on where that goes, and how we start to move forward with that. Would you be able to add a bit to that? And then one of our other panelists is here. I'll turn to him in a second. But would you be able to just speak about that for a second?
Sure. So basically, when the agreement, there's a couple of discussions. So each of the CO2 agreement, there's 13 articles in it. In the 13 articles, there's all these from protecting civilians all the way to humanitarian service, and also or having assistance, and DDR, which is reintegration of the Tigray defense forces of back into civilizations and everything like that. So there is a focus, right? Like there's that focus that's always been the main conversation on, you know, AU, the federal government, and everyone else, international community wants to make sure that DDR is fully completed. However, there's also the issue within that, the security challenge that we're seeing right now, right? Like, so I said 40% of the Tigray population, or Tigray, still is under occupation of the perpetrators, and where we're seeing presence of Eritreans and Amhara forces that are supposed to withdraw from Tigray according to the agreement have not, and they still remain within our area. And with that being said, the same things that we've seen, just imagine, we are talking about a cessation of hostilities agreement 2 years later, and I am in the free land of Tigray, and I'm telling you all the problems that we're noticing and the witnessing. But just imagine the first 8 months of Tigray genocidal war that we've seen is ongoing in those occupied areas, and it's been 4 years. For 4 years, they've been experiencing violence against all the atrocities and crimes that we've been seeing, of course, like sexual violence that we're seeing, mass killings, mass deportations that's taking place, war crimes, crimes against humanity, they're still ongoing, right? Like no one is having a conversation about the obvious things, like how would you have an agreement that says we will stop cessation of hostilities, and just because we don't hear the bullets, they are not there. That's not really the reality. It was in Tigray. The bullets exist. They're there. People are dying every day. No one is hearing their screams because we can't get to them. Even the people who want to help, the people like me who are here, the people themselves, our families, they can't get to the ones that are still under the occupation areas that we're seeing. So the security challenges that we're seeing, the political challenges that we're seeing, especially with the lack of goodwill, right? Like the federal government is the main perpetrator of Tigray genocidal war that we've seen. It's a fact. It's been seen. It's already been documented multiple times. And you know, how would you expect a criminal that has committed the crime on its own people would be held accountable by signing this agreement? Like there's no goodwill with the Ethiopian government or the federal government. They are not interested in working with Tigray authorities. Tigray itself basically lacks absence in the political dialogue within the parliament. We don't have a vote. We don't have a say as Tagaru or Tigrayan as a region. And so that representation from the federal institution just makes it basically we are still alone within the country that is keeping us hostage. It still remains as that. I've said it plenty of times. Tigray is a concentration camp. We've said that at the very beginning when it began, the genocidal war when it began, and now still is the same thing, right? Like people are leaving their homes because they're not being heard, right? They're not really being considered a citizen. And what's happening in Tigray, yes, you know, this is my home and this is my family, and that's why I can speak well about it, because I see it every day. However, what's happening with the entire Ethiopia, the whole country is burning, and no one seems to be paying attention to it in a way that is always being masked by something new agenda or new policies or new plans or new agreements that are coming into play. So I hope that answers your questions, James.
Thank you so much, Eden. I think it does. I mean, it answers the questions in as much as it poses more questions, and it poses more questions about where we go from here. But we'll park that for now. I'm going to turn now to Robel Alemu, who is from the American Amhara Association. The Amharas have also been undergoing their own persecution, and they also have been genocided too. Now, Robel, I'll pass over to you to speak now, and then I'll give you the floor.
Thank you so much, James. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Are you able to turn on your camera at all, or?
Let me see.
Great. Thank you.
Did that work?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, excellent. So thank you so much for having me on this presentation or this panel. We had a little bit of a back and forth this morning, James. So I think there was just a little bit of a misunderstanding with the format. So I hope you'll give me some leniency with that. But would you like me just to kind of go into an introduction overview, or?
Yeah, exactly that. If you just introduce yourself and then overview of the assessment of the situation that's ongoing in the Amhara region.
Sure.
That would be good.
Sure, excellent. So my name is Robel Alemu, and I serve as Director of Communications for the Amhara Association of America, or AAA for short. AAA is a civic organization based in Charlotte, North Carolina, and essentially does documentation of human rights violations in the context of conflict, violence, and political repression in Ethiopia. AAA's work goes back to 2016, at the time when there was large-scale protests in different parts of Ethiopia against the then ruling TPLF government. And then 2018, we had the Abey government, and unfortunately, the Abey regime has actually, in some ways, escalated human rights violations in the country. Now, with the Amhara region in particular, this has been a very large area of concern, particularly over the past 4 years, as there's been unabated war and conflict. Essentially, we had the devastating 2-year war in the northern part of the country. And when I say northern Ethiopia war, it's because it spanned 3 different regions, so Amhara, Afar, and Tigray. And unfortunately, a very significant amount of people suffered in that conflict. So that was November 2020 to November 2022. And that was that we say it ended with the signing of the cessation of hostilities agreement, or COHA. However, there is a widespread belief that that actually did not end the conflict or the war. Rather, it kind of shifted alliances and forged a new alliance between the Abey regime and the TPLF leadership. And so this is from the perspective of the Amhara community, of course. And when I talk about 4 years of a consecutive war, we're talking about a continuation of war, specifically with a new war confined to the Amhara region, which began in late April of 2023. So essentially, we've had a region that's been devastated by conflict with multiple actors. Initially, during the Northern War, we had invasion of different regions and kind of, a coalition of different actors based on different political leanings. During the Northern Ethiopia War, we had the TPLF and the Oromo Liberation Army forming a pact. There was also involvement of the Sudan Defense Force, and as well as other actors in different parts of the Amhara region. And that was very devastating. And then during the in the more recent war in Amhara, now we have a shifting where it's actually the ENDF primarily, as well as allied local and regional special forces and militias that have entered Amhara region, and for the past 1.5 years have been committing very gross human rights violations. And so for us as AAA, as a casualty reporting organization, we've tried to document some of this with our limited resources, but there's been real challenges, especially as it comes to access. There's been internet shutdowns, landline shutdowns, and an overall blackout in many parts of the Amhara region, especially over the past 1.5 years. And what that's done is it's created a very difficult environment for collecting information. So you can imagine, war crimes happening, people documenting that, maybe having footage, but it's very difficult for us to actually obtain that. But there has been some reporting, which has been very limited by the international media organizations as well as rights groups. So it's become very important, more important than ever, actually, for civic organizations to step up and play a role in doing this kind of work, even with the limited resources. Now, when I say limited access, part of it also is just the culture of, or an environment of repression. So essentially, the Abiy Ahmed regime has actually cracked down on Amhara residents throughout the country. So not just in the Amhara region, as well, also in the Oromia region, in the capital city of Addis Ababa and surrounding regions. And unfortunately, residents have been profiled, mass arrested. Initially, this was targeting people who were seen as dissenters, for example, independent journalists, which would report things that fell outside of the scope of the state media, as well as civil society leaders. Civil society had played a large role in issuing statements, for example, about current topics, and especially exposing some of the rights violations, which at times implicated the government forces. Also, sometimes medical doctors. So medical doctors in the entire medical system in the region has been greatly targeted, and other people. So that eventually actually expanded to be just full-on profiling and arrests. People would be accused, for example, of being rebel sympathizers. And so that created a very repressive environment, and really an environment of fear, as people would be fearful to come forward and even report what they had seen. So for example, there could be, a drone strike or that caused a large massacre in a marketplace or near a school, and there could be witnesses, but if they're concerned essentially that if they step up, that they would be targeted by government forces and then thrown in jail or worse. So extrajudicial killings is something that has been very rampant. And as from our perspective, like this is something that's gone on a daily basis. So, mass killings, mass arrests, and this is something that it's very difficult to find a day over the past year and a half in Amhara region where there hasn't been a massacre. So we at AAA have recorded between the period between early August of 2023 to August 2024 alone, over 200 civilian massacres in the Amhara region and in neighboring parts of Oromia. And that's, again, it's just the tip of the iceberg. It's what we could do with limited resources. So the situation is very dire. As I said before, the medical system, the health system is also in shambles. That's from a number of causes. Partly it's due to actual targeted attacks by government forces on these facilities, attacks not just on medical doctors and medical staff, but as well as on patients. And this has happened under different pretenses. The most common is accusing them of being rebel supporters, but there's others as well. And this has been covered also by, I believe, Human Rights Watch in a very extensive report released this past July. So I encourage listeners to read that report. But essentially, it's a very dire situation. The region has also been hosting a very significant number of internally displaced residents. And these displaced residents were displaced during the Northern War. They were displaced outside of that during outbreaks of violence and conflict in the neighboring Oromia region, where they faced ethnic-based attacks. And the Amhara region actually believes, or the Amhara people or community actually believes that this is a genocide, just from the sheer scale of the killings, as well as the geographic kind of expansiveness of it. So this is not something that's isolated to one region. It's something that's affected multiple regions. The Oromia region was particularly hostile for Amharas for a long time. Structurally, this goes back to policies that were put in place in the early 1990s by the TPLF government, including a regional constitution that essentially did not recognize Amhara residents there as actual citizens. So this is constitutionally, constitutionalized really apartheid. And the situation in Oromia is not unique. This was something that was done in other areas as well, where Amharas, which were a community that lived throughout Ethiopia, were essentially minoritized by law. And that minoritization means they did not have access to political representation, so they couldn't even go out and have, make political decisions or run for office. But this was something that was very nefarious, was very deliberate. And I think in many ways it ties into what we've been seeing over the past few years. Unfortunately, this war has been devastating, but I think in many ways the Pretoria Agreement actually played a role in instigating this conflict in Amhara that we've seen over the past year and a half. There's a belief that Pretoria Agreement essentially was a war pact between the Abey regime and the TPLF against the Amhara population. And as I said earlier, although the main perpetrators of the violence in Amhara has been the ENDF, the National Army, there has been involvement from Tigray regional forces, particularly in areas that are disputed. And so the disputed territories were an area that was actually a focal point of the Northern War as well. So these are called Welkait and Raya from the Amhara community. But I know the Tigrayan community has a different naming for them. But these were areas that in the early 1990s were actually redistricted under the Tigray region, but were historically under Amhara majority lands. So when the map actually changed in the 1990s, these areas were actually redistricted. And unfortunately, the indigenous Amhara residents faced targeted persecution since that time, but also following during the Northern Ethiopia War. So earlier this month, our community actually commemorated the 4-year anniversary of the Maikadra massacre. The Maikadra massacre actually stands out as one of the most horrific.
Robel, I'll give you just another minute to speak, and then we'll need to move on. Yes, if you could just summarize your remarks.
Sure. I'll wrap up. So just with the Maikadra massacre, this was actually the largest scale civilian massacre of the Northern War, and unfortunately, over 1,600 Amhara civilians were killed in the border town of Maikadra, which is located near the border between Ethiopia, Sudan, and Eritrea. And the reason why I want to highlight that is not just because our community has been commemorating the 4th-year anniversary, but also it just kind of highlights how the systematic, the structural causes of the violence, which I mentioned before, such as the constitution and the regional redistricting, ended up playing a part in some of this conflict and has really left scars in the local community. You know, these are families who have lost loved ones, who've lost fathers, breadwinners, children, spouses, and they're never going to get those people back. And unfortunately, the Pretoria deal failed to promote justice and accountability. The fact that it was a deal that was between the Abey regime and TPLF meant that the Amhara community was sidelined. And unfortunately, what that meant was you had two actors that perpetrated atrocities essentially being in this deal, and they were essentially in a position to exonerate each other of any accountability.
Robel,
so if
could you wrap up this now, if that's okay?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to move slightly on, but I just wanted to reiterate what I said at the start of the meeting. I think the cessation of hostilities agreement has failed everybody, and regardless of which group you belong to, the agreement doesn't work. And transitional justice infrastructure has not been implemented. Whether you're Tigrayan, whether you're Amhara, whether you're Oromo, wherever you are from within Ethiopia, whichever groups you belong to, and this agreement hasn't worked for anyone. And so, how we move forward with this transitional justice arrangement has to provide for all groups. I mean, there's a question that's in the chat, which is what is the current state of transitional justice processes, and particularly regarding Tigray, but we can also move that out to Amhara. Who is involved in this process, and have victim communities been involved? I'm going to turn that over to Eden to start with, and then Robel, I'll come back to you in a second, if that's okay.
All right, thanks, James. Yeah, so there's I'm not gonna go back and forth on a debate with Robel, but something that I always said is, you know, if our people were not killed, show me our people. That's all that matters. It's not about who was killed and what has happened and who's dead. It's a matter of really, we don't want. I don't want to have a debate number on, you know, who has killed or who has been killed more. That's not the case. But as you said, transitional justice, again, right now, transitional justice is not something that we've talked about it repeatedly as well, like as the international community, and also right now, even the following panel that's going to be discussing, transitional justice doesn't really work within Ethiopia, because we've seen it repeatedly done 2-3 times. It was drafted before. And it doesn't really apply. Transitional justice, like the verbiage itself, doesn't really apply with what's happening within Ethiopia right now. As Robel has mentioned it, there's a massacre every day happening in Amhara region, Oromia region, which is basically have been under shutdown for many years. So you basically have no information about Oromia at all. Addis Ababa itself is basically, you know, there's crimes that are taking place every day. People are committing suicide because of what's happening with Abiy Ahmed, the federal government situation, and also in Tigray, the occupations that we're seeing. Anywhere in Ethiopia, there's an issue. And while you have a crime or fire that is basically burning in every side of the country, you can't really have transition. That's basically it. And something that we've been trying to make sure is that, like, transitional justice was basically created by the federal government to cover up the COC agreement, or to basically dismiss the COC agreement or anything that's happening, all the violations that's taking place. Again, it's basically to avoid, it's avoidance of accountability, right? Like, so the federal government does not want to be accountable for any of the crimes that has been taking place. They know what they're participating in. And, you know, the good thing about the federal government is that they were very outspoken about it. There's videos every single day on Twitters and everything, and even just the basic denials of things that has been taking place, and even the intent that shows of genocide or war on Tigray, that we've heard it from officials, from the federal offices, and from even Abiy Ahmed Ali himself, right? Like, so what we're saying is that transitional justice was basically designed to mask and also avoid the accountability that the COC agreement would hold them accountable for, or also would be responsible for, but anything else for that matter, right? Like, so again, we are not discussing transitional justice until the COJ agreement is fully implemented. We're not discussing about that because, again, as I said earlier, I'm sitting here and I have 50 tents in front of me, which is IDPs who have not returned back home. These same IDPs are not getting their humanitarian assistance. Children are not going back to school. We're still seeing every day there's mass killings that's taking place within Tigray, even though they're calling it a cessation of hostilities or there's no bullets, it still is happening in Tigray. And also what's happening around the whole Ethiopia makes it really difficult to talk about transitional justice. So we've criticized the transitional justice. We've said that, it's flawed, it's quasi-compliance with the Ethiopian government, and that is marginalized on criminal accountability, right? Like, so again, it does not really hold anyone else as well. Basically, one of the other main perpetrators that we've seen is the Eritrean government and also the Eritrean militia, who is a foreign entity, who does not belong in Tigray, does not belong in Ethiopia. It still is within the borders of Ethiopia, committing human rights violations, and Ethiopia has no capacity nor the ability to really hold the Eritrean government or the militias, the Eritrean armies accountable for the crimes that they've committed. So the transitional justice basically cancels out all the crimes that have been committed by the Eritrean government, right? Like, so I'm really saying, like, it's not a debate that we need to go back and forth with. It's about one step next to something else, right? Like, so COJ agreement is the one binding policy agreement that we have. And that has not been completed, has not been fully implemented. And just to give you like a little bit of a perspective, where everybody's always talking about the DDR, that's the one thing that people think that it's being done. However, it's not being done, right? Like it has this mask. And again, earlier I was mentioning COJ agreement has no timeline. It does not have really a roadmap that makes any sense. Nobody really knows what's going to be done or when it's going to be done. Where are the resources coming? Who will be helping us? Who is responsible for what party by what? What are the benchmarks? We don't have any of these things. Therefore, it really makes it like just another policy that is just warming up a table. And then transitional justice, same thing. Roadmap just came out the other day. Nobody knows. It's basically in Amharic, and also it's not, the English version is not even out yet. So what we're saying is these are just reasons and excuses to really avoid accountability, what the Ethiopian government is doing. So when we don't talk about the COJ agreement, we are truly saying that Abiy Ahmed Ali and the federal government and what Ethiopia has done to the people of Ethiopians, which Tagaru, we are Ethiopians at the end of the day, until we're not, the genocidal war that has taken place by the green light of the Ethiopian government is going to be dismissed when we talk about transitional justice. So I choose not to talk about transitional justice. I choose to say we have an signed agreement that has not been fully implemented, and let's talk about that, because the COJ agreement is the only thing that I know for a fact that Abiy Ahmed Ali does not want us to talk about. And that means we are giving him the go to go ahead and do something else that he's doing. Simply come to Addis Ababa, see what's happening within the country. Forget the actual crimes that is happening within the regions that we've mentioned, from Oromia, Amhara, and Tigray, but just see the human rights violations that are taking place with Addis Ababa. Not criminal types, but human rights violations taking place in broad daylight. So what's happening in Ethiopia requires a major change, and also an honest conversation, in all honesty, because this debate is not going to get us out of this.
That leads me, thank you, Eden. That leads me really quite nicely onto my next set of questions for both of you, which is the international community has tried, I would say, and quite weakly, to get involved in this transitional justice arrangement and in what is happening in Tigray. The UK's newly appointed Minister Lord Collins has been in the region, and he's spoken on the issue of transitional justice. But what success has the African Union's monitoring, verification, and compliance mechanism had in trying to bring about any sort of peace? I'll turn to Robel first on this. But where has this gone? How have the African Union tried to lead efforts, and how have they tried to create change? And if they have, what have they managed to do?
Thank you, James. I think this is a worthwhile question, because when it comes to the Koha agreement, there was certainly outside observers, certainly a strong involvement of the AU, as well as other foreign actors. I think when it comes to the compliance mission, you can take DDR, for example, as my co-panelist Aiden has mentioned so eloquently, the DDR was not implemented. And so originally, I believe that was one of the articles, I think that was Article 6 of the Pretoria Agreement, that was actually requiring both parties to disarm within 30 days. And so clearly we did not see that happen. In interviews with regional leaders, months afterwards, with interviews by Geta Chireda, Debrezian, I believe as well, they admitted that there were hundreds of thousands of fighters that were not disarmed. And so it begs the question, what was the compliance mission doing if they weren't actually seeing this? And now I think when we talk about the regional leaders, it's also important to talk about the Abiy Ahmed, the federal authorities and the Abiy Ahmed regime, because the Abiy Ahmed regime, one has to wonder if there was a desire to see this happen as well. Again, this was an agreement that involved these two actors, but unfortunately excluded other key stakeholders, particularly the Amhara community, as well as others as well. The Afar community was greatly affected by the war. There was also the Eritreans and so on and so forth. But really, I can only speak from the Amhara perspective, and I can say that the Amhara felt like they were very much excluded. What we saw as part of the Pretoria Agreement, the dissolution of the Amhara Special Forces. So when I say the Special Forces, this is like a regional special force structure that is in place throughout all regions of the country. And these special forces were involved in conflicts as well as in peacekeeping activities. And when this policy was put in place in, I believe, early 2023, between February and about right before April, I think is when this process took place. Unfortunately, the process at the time, some experts actually criticized it for being selective and not taking into consideration the security needs of the region. And so when that took place, for example, the Oromia region special forces were left intact. The other regional special forces were left intact. And so it kind of shows you how there is a political motivation in a lot of these decisions. And especially when you have the Abiy Ahmed regime at the center, that's actually leading a lot of the decisions. We have to remember, this is an authoritarian regime. This is a regime that has committed, a mountain of human rights violations, mass atrocities. So they can't be trusted to, lead these types of processes. And for example, I mentioned the Oromia Region Special Forces. Based on our reporting, the Oromia Region Special Forces are not only involved in the war in Amhara, but were involved in actual massacres within Oromia region of Amhara minority populations. So it's a very alarming trend that we have seen. And unfortunately, this has gone on. And unfortunately, the AU and other actors have not played their role, and I think in the compliance, but that's also in connection with the Abiy regime, also there being a lack of political will, essentially. So I think that those two key points are very important. But I think when it comes to the agreement between the two sides, between the Abiy Ahmed regime and the TPLF, we had seen actually a lot of collaboration between these two forces after the Koha. So it looks like there was successfully a realignment or a political shift. In areas such as Lemt and Raya, we had seen displacement of a lot of residents after these two forces entered those areas. And again, these are areas that were disputed. And as part of the Koha, there was talk of resettling IDPs that were displaced from the Northern War, which is good. But unfortunately, in that process, the ENDF and the TPLF ended up displacing more residents, but these were Amhara residents. And unfortunately, the Amhara residents that were displaced since mid-April of 2024, many of them have not been able to return to their homes. And it just shows you, again, where was the AU when this was happening? There were so many visits from not just the AU, but also from various embassies to these regions. And even when they go to these regions, you can see that not all communities, for example, are consulted. So a lot of the time, the Amhara communities were not consulted. And unfortunately, these issues have been swept under the rug. With that being said, there were a couple of statements, I believe, in mid-April, in which the G7 and various other groups had raised concern over the displacement. But again, this is not enough. Saying you're concerned about something where there's tens of thousands of people being displaced and there not being any action to follow, it really, shows a lack of sincerity, and again, maybe even a lack of political will. And I think, sorry, James.
Yeah.
Am I over time?
I just wanted Yeah, I just wanted to answer, to go to some of the questions in the chat for a moment. I think your Robel, just to go back to your point there about political will, I think that's a really good point. And there's a couple of comments in the chat about it not being worth the paper it's written on, and I think that the Transitional Justice Agreement is exactly that. It's at the moment, as it is, it's not something that is effective or could be implemented effectively. And one of the questions in the chat relates to it not being translated into English. Eden, I know you've been answering that, writing answers to that in the chat, but I just wanted to go to that, and maybe if you could explain why that presents an issue in the first place, and why, basically how we can, whether that translating that policy into English would enable it to be to implement reforms and to be able to start to make that a more international agreement, to start to try and implement some sort of change.
Thanks, James. So yeah, I mean, just before I answer that, I think just wanted to touch up on the question on the AU-led monitoring and African Union. It's funny that they came actually to Tigray and they couldn't get past the security just because Eritrean forces would just not allow them. And this is just recently, not during the actual siege and when the violation was taking place. But this is again the absence of the transparent monitoring that we're seeing with the AU and the fact that the relapse into hostilities, it's going to take place. And we've said it, right? Like we've been saying it as Tagaro and Tigrayans, we've been saying like you cannot just avoid fire and just hope that it will just turn itself out. Like that's not really what was happening. And now it has a spread everywhere else, right? Like, and then we are going to see that backfire, like, because we're seeing people who are coming from other regions and now they're displaced here, right? Like, so on top of the people who already been displaced or Tagaro who are displaced within their own homes. So, but one of the DDR that I was mentioning, and that it was not fully being implemented, even though that's something it's been hyped up, right? Like this is being done and it's making people very anxious, and or it's basically the AU or the federal government or international community feels like DDR is being done. Well, the actual document basically says that disarmament of heavy weapons to be done concurrently with the withdrawal of the foreign and non-NDF forces, right? Like, so if DDR is supposed to take place, then everyone else who is still occupying Tigray must leave. That's supposed to be done at the same time. However, that's not what's being done. So DDR is not about, it's not like, I can't walk around here in Aksum because I have TDF with guns everywhere. Like, that's not really what's happening, right? What's happening is that we still have hostilities. We still have occupied areas. We're still seeing violence, except we can't hear it because it's still under mass. It still is under siege. It's basically been under occupied for 4 years. That first 8 months that we've seen in Tigray, that was taking place in the entire region of Tigray, and now it's happening in Western Tigray, Northern, Eastern, and in the Southern recently. And even we're seeing the newly released areas are still experiencing violence. So with these things that's making the talk of the conversation, they're not even, themselves are not being done as fully. But with that being said, transitional justice, right? Like, so even though I don't really want to have as much conversation about it, I don't want to acknowledge it, it is out there, right? Like, but then being silent about it and being quiet about it is not going to help us. And when it first came out, there were a couple copies. I think there's like the third copy or something was the green policy, which is the last one that was finalized. And the green policy, that was done in a way where you have a team of 5 people who basically created a team of team working groups or something, and they basically wrote this thing without talking to anybody. It was just some plan that just basically came out. And when we read it and we basically asked, and one of the questions I was asked is that, like, did it involve survivors? Did it involve victims? Were they asked? Do they know what transitional justice is? Like, so people don't know what this is. And even the COT agreement, people really lack awareness on that because no one is really sitting there and trying to understand what it really means. So with the transitional justice, when it first came out, and I do have my friend here who helped me as well with the translation, is that we were trying to understand what it is that they're saying. What are they selling? The U.S. government, everyone else was on it. They were excited. They were supporting the transitional justice, but there was it was not in a language that we can all understand, and also was not in a language that we can say this works or this doesn't work, and there was no mechanisms that was actually involved in it. And one of the biggest problems that we've seen is the lack of realistic pathway to the actual external accountability, or the fact that the victim-centered approach that we've said, it was never communicated. They came to Tigray once. The Transitional Justice Working Group, they came once. They basically, after repeated feedback on the transitional justice that said, you are not talking to CSOs, you're not talking to the people, you're not talking to the people on the ground, you're not discussing with people, you're just drafting this thing in your room. So go out there and talk to them, right? So that's when it actually the Tigray was able to provide a little feedback on the transitional justice. And that's when a couple other changes were possibly made, but it was not to the extent that it was really accepted. And even now, we can share it here with everybody. The transitional justice report, the English that we translated, we used it for other advocacy purposes, right? Just so we can raise awareness about it and say, there are some things that are lacking here in the quasi-compliance that we've repeatedly have mentioned, right? So the lack of it, there's way too many of them. It's basically from limitation and flaws, but also, again, it's a mask to avoid accountability. You cannot have a government that is involved in committing a crime or war crime or crimes against humanity, egregious crimes and continuous crimes in other regions and plus in occupied areas, and talk about transition. That's not happening.
I just want to make two comments. One is that our third speaker is now here. So I'll pass over to Kassay in a moment. But I just wanted to mention the DDR policy, obviously the disarmament, demobilization and reintegration policy. It's trying to create this sort of whole-scale mechanism to release a number of weapons, decommission combatants, and assist the transition back into civilian life for those within Tigray particularly, and to try and integrate some sort of a whole-scale peace-building effort. So I just wanted to add some clarity, just for anybody who's just for the recording and for anybody who even doesn't know what DDR stood for, but. Kassay, I know you're here. I wondered whether you are able to unmute and just give an introduction to yourself, and maybe we've been talking about the situation in Tigray and the situation in Amhara, and also where this transitional justice policy goes now, or this roadmap that is basically just is not worth the paper it's written on, which somebody has very said and written, and that's the general consensus here. But I just wonder whether you could come in and offer your thoughts.
I'm sorry for the inconvenience. I couldn't join you earlier. I think some technical problems hindered me to enter, and then now it works ultimately. And then, in fact, I didn't hear from others whether the issues, which issues have been touched upon, and then which issues have not addressed. But in general, now the transitional justice issue, as it has been now shaped in Ethiopia, is, in fact, I have heard some points from Eden, and then it doesn't work as the Tigrayans, and then all the government of Tigray and everybody in Tigray does not accept, as it has been now shaped the policy as well as the roadmap. Because it is already, it's not inclusive, and then it is shaped and then developed by the federal government alone, which is a party to the conflict, and then who has been leading all the war in Tigray, and then the perpetrator itself. And as well, when we see the roadmap, and then based on the policy, the roadmap, and then every actor which is mentioned in roadmap, the roadmap to implement, and then to be involved in the process of transitional justice, are almost 90% are the executive organs. All ministries, including led by the Minister of Justice, So this process doesn't work, and then everybody here doesn't accept. And then it's not only that, the Tigray is not in Ethiopia now, actually, because we know that in the parliament as well as the House of Federation, the two houses, nobody is represented from Tigray. In the cabinet body, and then the military, everybody's now, Tigray is linked with the federal government through the Pretoria Agreement alone. No one, nothing ties, no bond ties to Tigray to Ethiopia, otherwise in other government structures. So in this situation, everybody, without any involvement and then participation of Tigray officials, everything is being decided in Addis Ababa, and then that is very difficult. So not only that, then when we see the principles of the pillars of transitional justice, first acknowledgement and then truth, what happened on acknowledgement of what happened on the ground is very important. But still, the authorities in Tigray in Ethiopia are not accepting that, and then no regret. And then still some actors are still, their regret is not because they couldn't finish everything according to their plan. So in this context, it's very difficult to accept the transitional justice. But the Tigray people, as in situation and their situations and victims, they need transitional justice. They need to be held from all the atrocities they have sustained, but they need to be a genuine type of transitional justice, which is led by, and then especially the truth finding part should be taken over or has been handled by neutral organ, as such like the type of ICRI who has been investigating. Though it is known that everything cannot be handled by foreigners, but the main figures, including the foreign body, the Eritrean government involvement is make it difficult to be handled by domestically. We know from the investigations and the researches we have conducted that almost more than 50% of the atrocities committed is by the involvement of, by the Eritrean government, though it is by the invitation of the Ethiopian government. So this part will be totally, though the Ethiopian government may have been genuine, this the one party who has committed serious crimes will be out of the game. So that is not acceptable. So what could be the possibility maybe is now, maybe even living alone, the government, then politicians, maybe local communication of people-to-people communication, maybe the elite-to-elite communication by universities being in Tigray and the universities away in Amhara, in Afar, and the other parts of Ethiopia can discuss the issues, how they can reach on fair treatment and then genuine transitional justice. Even the people-to-people relationship may come to view elders and from Amhara side, elders from Afar side, and then Tigray side, the religious leaders from both sides, all sides may discuss and how to reach on genuine people-to-people relation, at least not to continue and then not to aggravate the situation, and then to improve the situation on both sides, in all sides. So that is, I think, the better way currently. One is this. Another is making the Ethiopian government and then pressing through the international communities and then establishing strong civil societies and other private actors so that the Ethiopian government to accept genuine transitional justice and then allow international organs to be involved within this transitional justice. Maybe in short.
Yeah, I think Kassay, thank you so much for your thoughts. I gave Kassay a little longer to speak there just because he hasn't been in from the start. But I think that from what we've all just said there, from Robel, from Eden, from Kassay, it's clear that from this panel that the Kohar has failed everybody, regardless of where you are within Ethiopia. The Kohar does not work, and it doesn't serve anybody's purposes apart from the Ethiopian government. And agreements that have happened so far have just given this air of legitimacy to their government, but failed to consider victims and the context on the ground for groups working to raise the needs of survivors and the raise of victims from this conflict. And this violence has just continued to perpetuate with no clear mechanism or pathway forward presented to try and end this. And also that tensions between groups remain at an all-time high. I think that from this, I'll go to Robel first, but I think there needs to be a concerted effort on the voice of victims in this justice process and a bottom-up approach to any transitional justice implementation within Ethiopia. But this will perhaps be the final question, but I want to just ask, what do we do both domestically within Ethiopia and internationally to try and move forward, or to put it in a different way, how can individuals help? How can those within Ethiopia and outside of Ethiopia help to move this forward and provide some form of justice, tangible justice, from a bottom-up approach for people on the ground to move forward and create this cohesive atmosphere that is for a long time missing? Robel, I'll bring this to you first.
Thank you, James. I think that's a very important question because at the end of the day, that's what we want to see. We want to see justice prevail. I think, speaking from the perspective of the Amhara community and someone that's been recording casualties in the war that's been ongoing, I think the first prerequisite is actually peace. For the Amhara community, they're still under active war. And so when you have active war, I think when we talk about transitional justice, it's insinuated that there is some type of stability and there's been a transition, but really there has been no transition. So it's the same regime that's in power, the Abey regime, that's actually leading this process with backing from foreign observers that have been giving his regime legitimacy. Unfortunately, he's just received extraordinary amounts of financial support from global financial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, as well as other major global leaders. And so there's this effort to legitimize him and to give that some type of reinforcement, but that's completely a mistake. And I think that approach will not lead to justice. In fact, it's going to lead to suppression and prevention of justice and obstruction of justice. And for the Amhara community, I think the main priority is how to end the war right now so people can finally get some breathing room. As I said, like before in my presentation, Amhara from all walks of life have been arrested. They're in concentration camps where they suffer abuses, where they suffer torture. And a lot of them are professionals. So these are the kinds of people who would be, for example, participating in discussions between communities, in all sorts of justice mechanisms, but they don't have the ability to do that because they've been jailed for their political beliefs. So if you have a regime that would jail people for their political beliefs, and in some cases just their identity, actually, you can't expect a process where there's going to be transitional justice. And I think it's really important that those individuals are released. I think people who are looking at the conflict right now can ask themselves, what kinds of platforms would be useful for trying to pass along that message to pressure the regime to release these political prisoners. In addition, the war itself needs to end. So, what are some ways to pressure the regime to end the war? And I think, as we're looking at what's been happening when it comes to these atrocities, mass atrocities that are ongoing, there needs to be condemnation, and there needs to be some type of decisive, action to condemn, but also to penalize the regime. So again, when you reward the regime as is committing these atrocities, it does not send a message that you're trying to support justice. So that it sends the opposite message. It sends the message that doing those things is okay. And I think that's a huge mistake. And it's basically a process where the Amhara voice continues to be stifled. And when it comes to the transitional justice, for example, and when it comes to national dialogue, when it came to these processes, there was a noticeable absence of activity in the Amhara region because the regime did not want to acknowledge what was happening there. So they wanted to pretend like, there's this fire going on over here in the middle of the country, in the northern part of the country, but we're just going to pretend like it's not happening. And that approach, I think, is not conducive to any type of progress. So if we really want to pursue, justice, I think condemning what's been happening, penalizing the regime. So this could be, for example, in the form of sanctions, targeted sanctions against political leaders and military leaders, the likes of Abiy Ahmed, the likes of Field Marshal Burhanu Jula, because these are the figures which are not only leading the atrocities, but are then going on state media and then gaslighting victims. So they, in a state media appearance back in December of 2023, after some of the initial rounds of drone strikes, which led to massacres in Amhara, Burhanu Jula literally went on state media and said that he doesn't recognize that there was any targeting of civilians. So they can't even acknowledge what's happening. They're saying that nothing's happened. And then they say they're going to continue to use these weapons, which is what we've seen. And so people continue to die. The casualty counts are skyrocketing. And, it's an emergency, really. It's an emergency that needs to be addressed. And then I think we can progress to a stage where we can begin to address some of these other things. And I think going back to the failure of the Koha, the fact that the Pretoria Koha was not inclusive also was a missed opportunity. And I think the exclusion of the Amhara community there really didn't do it any justice. I think a lot of the problems that were related to this war, the structural causes, were not addressed. So earlier I mentioned, for example, parts of like the Constitution, the constitutional order, the federal arrangement. A lot of these territorial issues, for example, are things that could have been addressed, but that was a missed opportunity. It wasn't addressed. And now you have, more victimization in these areas, and unfortunately not enough attention for those that have been victimized. So earlier I mentioned, the joint ENDF and TPLF operations in the Raya and Talampt areas, and this has been almost completely ignored. As earlier I mentioned, there was just a few statements at the very beginning from some of the embassies, but aside from that, it was just brushed under the rug. And so there's this belief, I think, from the international community, that by supporting the Abiy Ahmed regime, that they could kind of see some semblance of stability in Ethiopia, maybe. But I think that is a gross, a mistake in their estimations. And I think expecting peace from the Abiy regime or from actors who have been committing gross human rights violations, it's like expecting, what's the expression, honey from a fly, or, whatever the case might be. So I think we need to steer towards having honest conversations. We need to have more transparent processes. The Abiy regime is not known for transparency. It's not known for inclusivity. So that is something that we can't expect. And we need to move away from, just these PR maneuvers, planting trees, green legacy. People are dying, people are being slaughtered in the hundreds on a daily basis, and then they're planting trees, pretending like they care about the environment. And so I think we need to stop enabling that. And I think it begins by speaking out and calling a spade a spade. Thank you.
Yeah, Robel, I think that you raised some good points there regarding the fact that there is little transitional justice infrastructure, and anything that needs to be done moving forward, we need international support in that, but also we need to try and find some sort of benchmark, some sort of a way forward that we can start to structure any sort of implementation of the cessation of hostilities agreement. I'm going to turn that over then now back to Eden, if you want to take that question, which was where do we go from here, basically.
Okay, thanks, James. I was just answering some questions on the chat.
Yeah, I did see that. So yeah.
It's a lot of good questions, and this is, again, I hope everybody understands that, there's more discussions that needs to go into this, and there's more work that goes into this before we really see any change or hope or towards the right direction. So what could be done next for Tigray, from Tigray perspective, of course, I see everything. I'm not just here to say, justice and accountability. And again, as vague as that could be, right? Like justice and accountability, it has different meanings to everybody. You have IDPs that says, just return me home. You have survivors who say, I just need medication. You have kids that say, I just want to go back to school and see my friends. So justice and accountability, it really is like up to the person. It's relevant to the person. But our thing is like, it needs to have a multiple approach, right? Like what's happening in Tigray, one cannot wait to the other, right? It's not a system. Like the layers that we've seen, the sectors that we've seen, the damage that we're seeing, the humanitarian crisis, the situation, the moral that's happening, like just being able, I was in Tigray before the war and pre-COVID, and I know what Tigray looked like, and I know what the people look like. And now I see them, they've changed, they are different, and you could just sense it. And it's everything around you, like everything that we're seeing, from everyday daily news to anything else that's happening across, like that makes a person want to not really be themselves any longer. Like, so all the issues we're seeing, they're all affecting people one way or another. And like, we can't just be sitting here and saying, okay, transitional justice needs to be done in this way, and then COH agreement is this. Like, our focus is not on that. At least mine is not only just on one thing, but like with the multiple approaches that we do have, all the way from the humanitarian, assistance that needs to be provided. If the international community, and I know with what's happening around the world, budget is low. We've been told repeatedly, funding is low, and everybody needs help. Everyone needs help. And so that way, if we can't get it from the international community as supposed to, or IMF is not going to provide it, or WHO, or WFPF, or everyone, USAID can't provide it, what do we need to do? Like, we need to find solutions within our homes, so that way we can survive until tomorrow, right? Like, I don't like waiting. I don't like having to say like someone is going to do something for me, or the transitional justice will be done by somebody, or COH agreement will be implemented by the federal government because she may have a change of heart. That's not going to happen. So what do we need to do now? That's why I am here in Tigray, and that's why I'm doing one little things at a time, so that way something is being done. It's not changing the world, but it's something is being done. And so the approach with the humanitarian situation that we're seeing, the human rights violations we're seeing, those needs to be addressed as we are, again, trying to go to the bigger agenda, the bigger view that we have, which is truth finding. In all honesty, if you do find the truth, it's going to solve a lot of our problems. I'm not going to lie about it, because one, you have the truth, and that's when people are more likely to say, okay, this is what happened. And that's when you can get to that justice and accountability. That's when sometimes being, people say like the truth will set you free, right? Like, finding the truth itself will be a relief to some people, right? The situation that was mentioned earlier, like the Mekele massacre. Give us the truth, and then we'll go ahead and move on to the next step, right? Like, and I'm not dismissing the people who have been killed. I'm not saying that, but what I'm saying is the truth finding needs to be a priority for everybody within Ethiopia, or else we will just be pointing fingers. We'll be saying mine is worse than yours, and that's not how it works, right? Like, so the truth finding, prosecution will come after that, of course, if we are talking about alternative to the policy or alternative to the COH agreement, and a reparation and compensation, and then institutional reform, right? Like, we can't just go ahead and take down Abiy Ahmed Ali today. We cannot just put Ethiopia into ICC, part of the ICC, so that way ICC can form. Like, there's all these things that really makes a problem for us, as Ethiopia have a lot of okay cards, or at least good cards in their side, right? Like, and now it has joined BRICS. So you have all these issues. So we can't just, it's not, if I can't do it, who else will do it? That needs to be in our mentality. And in all honesty, I focus on our people. I focus on my people. I'm not talking about politically. I'm not talking about something bigger. What do we do today? And what is it that we may be able today and save somebody tomorrow? How do we get our kids back to school? Because the war may end today, But if we have kids who have not went to school, we just lost 20, 30 years or the future generation of Tigray. That's the biggest failure for me. So with that being said, I think there's a lot of work to be done. And I do hope that everybody really comes together and say like, okay, what can we do? What is within our capacity? And how do we get to tomorrow? That needs to be the way, or else we cannot expect Abiy Ahmed Ali to just step down from the power. We cannot expect Abiy Ahmed Ali to go, or Isaias Afwerki to go to ICC, or somebody to just determine Tigray genocide. So, which has happened, but we can't wait for somebody to designate that for us. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Eden. I think that air of impunity, which is sort of just being bred in Ethiopia and has just become ubiquitous, something needs to be done about that specifically. But as you say, there are so many steps that need to be taken to try and get somewhere with any sort of transitional justice arrangement. Kassay, I'll pass on to you before I wrap this up, just for final comments on where we go with this transitional justice policy. I'll just say we'll place a recording of this on our YouTube, and we will also follow up with anybody who wishes to be a part of any sort of policy brief that we write as a result of this on trying to renew a transitional justice policy for Ethiopia. But Kassay, I'll pass over to you.
Maybe at the points I haven't heard you. Some sound this. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Maybe I haven't heard you the final question on which I should reflect.
Sorry, yeah, I know the internet there is quite poor, but I wanted to sort of ask, where do we go from here? The transitional justice arrangement doesn't work. There is no attempts to end the impunity of the Ethiopian government. Where do we go now?
In fact, it's difficult to have a solution for this situation, but just we should do well. Always we have to try to get solutions and to be in a better situation to our people, at least to recover from the situations we are in. So as Eden has correctly said, we have to work our best. We have to try our best on the ground, as well as what we have within what we have, and then what our people and our civil societies, our elites can do, and then as well as to press on international community so that they can pressurize the government to be at least genuinely act. Currently, as it has been said, no sign of any improvement, no sign of reform. When you think of transitional justice, you have to try to put some reforms. Transition means from some worse situation to the better situation, from autocracy to democracy, from war to peace, and then settlement. But what we are observing in the country is, as every corner of the country, there is war continuing. Even in Tigray, the situation is not being improved. The Koha is not being implemented as it has been expected. Areas, almost 40% of the areas are under occupation. People are suffering in Tigray, under occupation. Still today, people are being forcefully disappeared. Women are being raped, and then they are being tortured, and then they can't speak loudly what they want. They have no any humanitarian access, and then even they have no access to road to travel and to ask each other. Even they cannot bury their loved ones in neighbor areas, especially in the border areas. So as it has been said, IDPs are under their situation, people under still. So the recovery issue is very important. The civil societies, NGOs, even our religious leaders, others should involve in the way they can heal their very traumatized people. So that is something which locally can be done. In addition, we have to involve in the situations which can strengthen our people so that to advocate for themselves. Maybe for themselves, like establishing forums, associations, victim associations, and different organizations, so that of victim coalitions, so that to advocate for themselves, and these things can be made. In addition, internationally, all Tigrayans and other people who are working for these people in their situation should be organized and create pressure on the government. These various strategies, through various strategies that we have to continue to change the situation. Otherwise, though there is no specific legal ground, because the ground doesn't allow to act on, but you can't also accept what cannot be accepted. The type of transitional justice which is being taken place or being shaped by the Ethiopian government, and then no one expects justice from that side, and then we have to work for ourselves, and then we have to always push for genuine justice and for the end of impunity. That would be always working without any. We shouldn't give up. That what is to be in place. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm just conscious of time, and also I know that the chat, there are quite a few people talking in the chat, and I think the main consensus here is that we need to partner with organizations, we need to partner with governments, we need to work together with external organizations to try and provide some sort of roadmap and some sort of way forward to leverage the Ethiopian government to create to implement a lasting, sustainable peace, and to enable the ability to have a just transition towards peace. And I think just as we're very short on time now, I just wanted to wrap up and just thank our speakers, and just to say that these conversations, obviously, we don't find solutions. We can't solve these issues, but we can provide a platform for people to be able to talk about the solutions and talk about what needs to be done. And I think this will provide a great platform to be able to continue to work on where we can move forward. And as I've said before, we will be providing a policy brief as a result of this talk, and many of the issues that have come up. I just wanted to make our audience aware that we will have a next talk, which will be later this month, in a couple of weeks' time, which will be on Afghanistan and the ongoing gender apartheid there. So that's our next talk. So please do keep an eye out for information regarding that. But I just wanted to take this time to just thank our three speakers, Robel Alemu, Eden, Kassa, and Kassay Gebray, for their time. And thank you all for attending. But please do keep up to date on what we're doing on this and on other topics. And thank you all for your time. I'm going to end the recording now, and that will go onto our YouTube channel too. So please do just keep an eye out for what's next. So thank you all.
Thank you very much. Thank you for.